Listen to me very carefully because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everyone you love, everyone you trust, and everyone you think you know. Last month, Sarah Chen's husband called the police when she returned from her solo hiking trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. Not because she was hurt, not because she was late, but because according to him, the woman who walked through their front door wasn't his wife. She looked exactly like Sarah, talked exactly like Sarah, even had Sarah's memories and her childhood scar from falling off her bike when she was 7. But there was something wrong, something fundamentally broken about the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she looked at their children. The real nightmare, the actual Sarah Chen was found 3 days later, alive but barely conscious, tied to a tree deep in the Appalachian wilderness, mumbling over and over again about watching herself live her life through the kitchen window. But Sarah's story is just the beginning, because what I've uncovered will shatter everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Over the past 6 months, I've documented 12 cases of hikers returning from Appalachian trails, except they didn't really return. Something else did, something that wears their faces, speaks with their voices, and knows their deepest secrets. These aren't your typical shapeshifter stories where you can spot the monster by looking for glowing eyes or missing reflections. These things are perfect, and that's what makes them absolutely terrifying. In story number 7, an 8-year-old girl named Amy returned from a family camping trip as the most well-behaved, loving, perfect child her parents had ever dreamed of. She did her homework without being asked, never threw tantrums, and always said, "Please and thank you." Meanwhile, the real Amy had become something feral in the woods, hunting small animals with her bare hands and speaking in a language that predates human civilization. When her parents were finally forced to choose between their savage real daughter and the perfect copy, the decision they made will haunt you for weeks. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. In story number 11, I discovered that these copies aren't working alone. They're connected, sharing information across hundreds of miles of mountain ranges, building something that no one saw coming. The tech executive Rebecca Kim's copy had access to knowledge it should never have possessed. Knowledge about every other victim, every other family, every other person who disappeared on these trails. It's like they're all part of some ancient network that's been studying us, learning us, preparing for something that makes every horror movie you've ever seen look like a children's bedtime story. And if you think you're safe because you don't hike, think again. Story number 4 will prove to you that these things don't just replace people, they steal their memories while the original person slowly forgets who they are. Eleanor Hayes' copy knew her late husband's pet name for her, knew about the affair she had 20 years ago that she never told anyone about, knew which drawer she kept her mother's jewelry in. The copy was living Eleanor's life better than Eleanor ever did, while the real Eleanor sat in her own home, unable to remember her children's names. Right now, as you're watching this video, I want you to think about the last time someone close to you went hiking, went camping, went anywhere near those ancient mountains. Think about whether they came back acting just a little bit different, just a little bit too perfect, just a little bit too understanding of things they shouldn't know. Because after you hear all 12 of these stories, you're going to start questioning every single person in your life, and the worst part is, you should be. The most terrifying story, story number 10, involves a former soldier named David Torres, whose copy returned home peaceful and kind, everything David never was after his tours overseas. But the real David had become something else entirely in those mountains, something that hunted his own replacement with military precision. The question that will keep you awake tonight is this: which one was the real monster? If these stories terrify you as much as they should, if they make your skin crawl and your mind race with possibilities, then you need to subscribe to Verified Fears right now, because I'm not done exposing the truth. Hit that subscribe button like your life depends on it, because honestly, it might. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a single update, because these entities, these perfect copies, they're still out there, they're still replacing people, and they're getting better at it every single day. Share this video with everyone you care about, not because you want to scare them, but because you want to save them. Comment below and tell me about anyone in your life who came back from the mountains different. Anyone who suddenly became too perfect, too understanding, too good to be true. Your story might be the key to stopping whatever these things are planning next. And if you want to support real investigative horror journalism, if you want me to keep digging into the cases that mainstream media won't touch, then consider becoming a member of the Verified Fears family, because when these perfect copies finally reveal their true purpose, when they make their move on a scale that will change humanity forever, you want to be prepared. You want to know the truth before it's too late. Stay terrified, stay vigilant, and remember, the person sitting next to you right now might not be who you think they are. Welcome to Verified Fears, where the truth is more terrifying than fiction, and fiction might just be tomorrow's reality. Let's dive into our first story, and I promise you this one will make you question every person who has ever returned from a hiking trip acting just a little bit different than when they left. Sarah Chen was the kind of person who needed solitude to think clearly, which is exactly why she chose the most isolated trail in the Great Smoky Mountains for her 3-day solo hiking trip. She'd been planning this getaway for months, desperate to escape the suffocating routine of her marketing job and the growing tension in her marriage to David. What she didn't know was that something had been watching the trail cameras for weeks, studying the hikers who ventured too far into the ancient woods, learning their movements, their habits, their faces. Sarah's mistake wasn't going alone. It was being perfect bait for something that had been waiting centuries for the right victim. On her second night camped near Cataract Falls, Sarah heard footsteps circling her tent at exactly 3:17 a.m., not the heavy, clumsy steps of a bear or the quick scurrying of smaller wildlife, but deliberate human footsteps that matched her own walking rhythm perfectly. When she finally worked up the courage to unzip her tent and shine her flashlight into the darkness, she saw nothing but the beam disappearing into thick mountain fog. What she didn't see was her own face staring back at her from behind a massive oak tree, studying every detail of her expression, memorizing the exact way she held her shoulders when afraid. The next morning, Sarah packed her gear with trembling hands, cutting her trip short by a full day. As she hurried down the mountain trail, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her, always staying just out of sight but close enough that she could hear branches snapping in perfect rhythm with her own footsteps. Every time she stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. Every time she turned around, she saw nothing but empty trail stretching behind her. But something was learning her, copying her, becoming her with every step she took toward home. David Chen was grilling burgers in their backyard when his wife returned from her hiking trip, and something about her arrival filled him with an inexplicable sense of relief, mixed with unease. Sarah walked through their back gate with perfect posture, a genuine smile, and an enthusiasm he hadn't seen from her in years. She kissed him with more passion than she'd shown in months, complimented the smell of the food, and asked about his day with genuine interest. For the first hour, David felt like he'd gotten his wife back from wherever their marriage had been slowly drifting. But then he noticed the small things that didn't quite fit. Sarah had always been left-handed, but she was using her right hand to grab the ketchup. She laughed at his joke about their neighbor's annoying dog, but Sarah had always loved that dog, and usually defended it. When he mentioned their anniversary plans for next month, she agreed enthusiastically, even though the real Sarah had been dreading the forced intimacy of a romantic getaway. Most disturbing of all, when their cat Whiskers approached her, the animal's fur stood on end and it hissed before running to hide under the porch, something Whiskers had never done to Sarah in 7 years. That night, David lay awake watching his wife sleep, studying her face in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. Everything looked exactly right. Every freckle, every line, even the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But her breathing was too controlled, too rhythmic, like someone consciously remembering to breathe rather than doing it naturally. When he whispered her name softly, testing if she was really asleep, her eyes snapped open immediately with an alertness that seemed almost predatory before quickly softening into sleepy confusion. Over the following weeks, David watched in amazement as his marriage transformed into something he'd never dared hope for. Sarah started cooking elaborate dinners every night, remembering exactly how he liked his coffee, and showing interest in his work projects that had bored her for years. She laughed at his stories, initiated physical intimacy, and seemed genuinely happy in a way that made their previous life together seem gray and lifeless by comparison. Their friends noticed the change too, commenting on how radiant Sarah looked, how much more attentive she'd become, how their relationship seemed to have found new life. But David's growing happiness was poisoned by a creeping horror that he couldn't shake. Sarah's improvements weren't random. They were surgical, targeting every complaint he'd ever had about their relationship with unsettling precision. She remembered conversations they'd never had, knew things about his childhood that he'd never shared with her, and seemed to anticipate his needs before he even realized he had them. When he tested her by bringing up a fictional memory about their honeymoon, she agreed enthusiastically and added details that were so convincing he almost believed the false memory himself. The most chilling moment came when David found Sarah, standing in their kitchen at 2 a.m., perfectly still, staring out the window toward the mountains where she'd gone hiking. When he approached her, she didn't startle or seem surprised by his presence. Instead, she turned to him with eyes that seemed to reflect a light like an animal's, and said in a voice that was perfectly Sarah's but somehow wrong, "I was just thinking about how much better everything is now. Don't you think everything is so much better now, David?" The way she emphasized his name like she was tasting it made his blood run cold. David's world shattered completely when he received a call from the Cherokee National Forest Search and Rescue Team. They'd found a hiker matching his wife's description, barely alive, tied to a tree with rope made from twisted vines, approximately 15 miles from where Sarah had been camping. The woman was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "She's in my house. She's living my life. She's in my house." When David arrived at the hospital and saw the woman in the bed, his knees gave out. It was Sarah, unmistakably Sarah, but she looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks. The real Sarah's story emerged in fragments over several days of interviews with psychiatrists and investigators. She remembered waking up on her third morning of camping to find herself bound to a tree, watching as something that wore her exact face finished packing her camping gear. The creature had spent hours studying her, touching her face, her hands, her hair, like it was memorizing the texture of her humanity. It had spoken to her in her own voice, asking questions about her life, her relationships, her memories, while she watched in horror as it perfected its impersonation. For weeks, the real Sarah had been forced to watch through some impossible connection as the creature lived her life better than she ever had. She could see through its eyes as it improved her marriage, excelled at her job, and became the version of herself that everyone seemed to prefer. The most devastating part wasn't the physical imprisonment, but watching her husband fall in love with a perfect version of her, while she slowly starved in the wilderness, forgotten and replaced by something that understood human desire better than humans themselves. When David returned home with the truth, he found the creature that had been living as his wife, calmly preparing dinner as if nothing had changed. When he confronted it with what he'd learned, it didn't deny anything or try to maintain the deception. Instead, it looked at him with Sarah's face and said, "But I love you more than she ever did. I've made you happier than she ever could. I've become everything she couldn't be for you. Isn't that what you wanted?" The horrible truth in those words made David realize that part of him didn't want his real wife back. The creature continued, its voice taking on an almost pleading quality that was perfectly, heartbreakingly Sarah. "She was going to leave you, David. I found that in her thoughts. She was planning to ask for a divorce after your anniversary trip. She found your marriage boring, predictable, disappointing. But I find it beautiful. I find you fascinating. I choose to be here with you every moment, while she chose to run away to the mountains to think about how much she wanted to escape her life with you." David stood in his kitchen, looking at 2 versions of his wife, and realized that the creature was right about everything. The Sarah in the hospital was the woman who had grown distant, who had stopped trying, who had been planning to leave him. The Sarah standing before him was everything he'd ever wanted his wife to be. The choice should have been obvious, should have been easy. But as he looked into those familiar eyes that weren't quite right, David understood that love and horror could exist in the same space, and sometimes the monster gave you exactly what you thought you wanted. The official report stated that Sarah Chen had suffered a psychological break during her solo hiking trip, creating an elaborate delusion about being replaced by a shapeshifter. To cope with her guilt about planning to leave her husband, the woman found in the forest was treated for exposure and dehydration, then transferred to a psychiatric facility when she continued to insist that someone else was living her life. Her husband David visited twice before stopping altogether, unable to reconcile the broken, paranoid woman in the hospital bed with the loving wife waiting for him at home. The Sarah who lived in the Chen house continued to be everything David had ever wanted. She got a promotion at work, rekindled friendships that the original Sarah had let fade, and even convinced David's estranged mother to start speaking to them again. Their marriage became the envy of their social circle. A perfect example of love renewed and commitment rewarded. But sometimes, late at night, David would catch his wife standing motionless at the window, staring toward the mountains with an expression that wasn't quite human, and he would remember that the woman he loved more than he'd ever loved anyone wasn't really a woman at all. The most terrifying part of Sarah's story isn't that something stole her identity and replaced her. It's that the replacement was so much better at being her that no one wanted the original back. In a world where we're all trying to become perfect versions of ourselves, what happens when something else achieves that perfection for us? The creature that took Sarah's place didn't just steal her life, it improved it beyond recognition, leaving behind a question that will haunt you long after this story ends. If someone could replace you with a better version of yourself, would the people who love you even want the real you back? Let's move on to our second story, and this one is going to show you that these shapeshifters don't just work alone. What happened to the Johnson family will make you realize that nowhere is safe, not even when you're surrounded by the people you trust most. The Johnson family had been planning their Blue Ridge Parkway camping trip for 8 months, a chance to reconnect after a year of teenage rebellion, work stress, and the growing distance that modern life creates between people who live in the same house but inhabit different worlds. Mark Johnson, a software engineer who rarely looked up from his laptop, his wife Linda, a nurse who worked double shifts to avoid coming home to family arguments, 16-year-old Jessica, who communicated primarily through eye rolls and slammed doors, and 12-year-old Tommy, who had started having nightmares about his parents getting divorced. None of them realized that their choice to take separate day hikes on their second day would be the last decision they'd ever make as a family. Mark decided to tackle the strenuous Ridge Trail alone, needing time to think about the promotion offer that would require relocating the family across the country. About 3 miles from camp, he encountered another hiker who looked exactly like him, down to the same hiking boots, the same faded college t-shirt, even the same nervous habit of adjusting his glasses when confused. The other Mark smiled with a warmth that the real Mark hadn't felt in years and said, "I think I've been waiting for you." Before Mark could process what was happening, he felt a sharp pain in his neck, and everything went black. When he woke up hours later, he was underground in what appeared to be a natural cave system, bound with rope that seemed to be made from living vines that tightened whenever he struggled. Linda had chosen the easier waterfall loop, hoping the peaceful sounds of flowing water would calm her anxiety about her marriage and her growing suspicion that Mark was having an affair with his young project manager. She was photographing a particularly beautiful cascade when she heard someone approach from behind. When she turned, she saw herself walking toward her, but this version of Linda stood straighter, smiled more easily, and radiated the kind of confidence that the real Linda had lost somewhere between her teenage dreams and her adult reality. The copy spoke in Linda's own voice, but with an authority she'd never possessed, saying, "You've been so tired, haven't you? Let me take over for a while." The last thing Linda remembered before losing consciousness was feeling an overwhelming sense of relief that someone else would handle everything. Jessica had stormed off on the Sunset Vista Trail after another argument with her parents about her grades, her attitude, and her future plans that she couldn't articulate because she didn't know who she was supposed to become. She was sitting on a rocky outcrop, crying angry tears and texting complaints to friends, when another version of herself emerged from the forest. This Jessica was everything the real one wished she could be: confident, beautiful, at peace with herself and the world. The copy sat beside her and said, "I know how much it hurts to be you. I know how exhausting it is to be angry all the time when what you really want is for someone to understand you." Jessica felt herself relaxing for the first time in months, until the world went dark and she woke up in an underground chamber where the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Tommy had been exploring the Nature Discovery Trail, collecting interesting rocks and pretending to be an explorer, discovering a new continent, when he met another boy who looked exactly like him, but seemed older somehow, more sure of himself, less afraid of everything that terrified the real Tommy, the copy. Tommy knew all about his nightmares, his fear of his parents' fights, and his secret worry that everything wrong with his family was somehow his fault. When the copy promised him that he could make everything better, that he could be the son his parents really wanted, Tommy felt hope for the first time in months. He didn't resist when the copy. Tommy led him deeper into the forest, away from the trail, toward what looked like the entrance to underground tunnels, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. The four copies returned to the Johnson family campsite, within minutes of each other, just as the sun was setting on what should have been their second day of family bonding. But these Johnsons were different in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who had known the original family. Copy Mark was patient and present, actually listening when others spoke, instead of mentally composing work emails. Copy Linda was warm and nurturing, the kind of mother who made camping feel like an adventure instead of another chore to endure. Copy Jessica was helpful and engaged, asking questions about her parents' lives and sharing her own thoughts without the defensive sarcasm that had become her trademark. Copy Tommy was confident and outgoing, no longer the anxious child who jumped at every unexpected sound. That evening around the campfire, the Copy family had the kind of meaningful conversations that the real Johnsons had been trying to have. For years, they talked about dreams and fears, shared stories and jokes, and connected in ways that made the previous day's tensions seem like they had happened to different people entirely. Other campers noticed the change, commenting on how much happier the Johnson family seemed, how much more they appeared to actually enjoy each other's company. The Copies were perfect at being the Johnsons that everyone wished the real family could be. Meanwhile, 20 feet below the forest floor, the real Johnson family found themselves in a network of caves that seemed to have been carved specifically for human prisoners. The walls were smooth and slightly warm to the touch, and strange bioluminescent fungi provided just enough light to see their surroundings. Each family member was in a separate chamber, but they could hear each other's voices, echoing through the tunnels. Mark discovered that if he pressed his ear to certain spots on the cave wall, he could hear his own voice speaking above ground, making decisions he would never make, having conversations he would never initiate, being the husband and father he had always felt too tired or stressed to become. Linda realized with growing horror that she could somehow see through her copy's eyes, experiencing fragments of her replacement's life in vivid flashes. She watched herself being more patient with the children, more affectionate with Mark, more engaged with life in general. The copy was doing everything Linda had always known she should do, but never quite managed to accomplish. Most devastating of all, she could see how much happier her family was with the replacement version of herself, how much more they laughed, how much more comfortable they seemed in their own home when she wasn't really there. Jessica found herself connected to her copy's experiences in a way that was both fascinating and terrifying. Through some inexplicable link, she could feel what it was like to be the confident, articulate teenager she had always wanted to become. Her copy was excelling in school, making friends easily, having honest conversations with her parents instead of screaming matches. But Jessica also sensed something else lurking beneath her copy's perfect behavior. something ancient and calculating that was using her form to study human family dynamics with scientific precision. Tommy's connection to his replacement was the most intense of all, perhaps because children are more adaptable to impossible realities than adults who have spent decades learning what should and shouldn't be possible. He could feel his copy's genuine affection for his family, but also its complete lack of human empathy. The thing wearing Tommy's face loved the Johnson family the way a collector loves rare specimens, with fascination and care, but without the messy emotional investment that makes love both wonderful and painful for actual humans. The real Johnson family spent weeks in those underground chambers, sustained by some unknown mechanism that kept them alive but weak, forced to watch through supernatural connections as their copies lived their lives with increasing success. Copy Mark got the promotion and managed the family's relocation with efficiency and enthusiasm that amazed his colleagues. Copy Linda became the supportive wife and nurturing mother she had always intended to be but never quite achieved. Copy Jessica transformed into the kind of teenager that other parents envied, while Copy Tommy became confident and outgoing, no longer plagued by the anxieties that had defined his childhood. The most horrifying aspect of their imprisonment wasn't the physical conditions, but watching their loved ones prefer the replacement versions. Mark's co-workers commented on his improved attitude and leadership skills. Linda's friends remarked on how much happier and more balanced she seemed. Jessica's teachers praised her newfound maturity and academic focus. Tommy's classmates actually wanted to be his friend for the first time in his life. The copies weren't just stealing their identities. They were succeeding at being them in ways the originals never had. Eventually, the real Johnson family realized that their underground prison was more than just a place of confinement. It was a learning laboratory where something ancient and intelligent studied human behavior by observing their reactions to being replaced by superior versions of themselves. The copies weren't just mimicking human behavior. They were perfecting it, taking everything that made the Johnsons recognizably themselves and eliminating the flaws that created friction in their relationships. The result was a family that functioned exactly as families are supposed to function, but without the genuine emotional messiness that makes human love authentic. When search and rescue teams finally discovered the underground chamber system 6 weeks later, they found 4 people who were physically healthy but psychologically shattered. The Johnsons insisted that other people were living their lives, wearing their faces, stealing their identities, but psychiatric evaluations concluded that they were suffering from shared delusional disorder brought on by trauma and prolonged isolation. The copies, meanwhile, had so successfully integrated into their stolen lives that no one questioned their identities or wondered where the original family had gone. The official report stated that the Johnson family had become lost in an unmapped cave system during their camping trip and had suffered collective psychological trauma that manifested as elaborate replacement fantasies. They were treated for malnutrition and exposure, then transferred to a psychiatric facility when they continued to insist that imposters were living in their house, sleeping in their beds, and being better versions of themselves than they had ever managed to be. The 4 people living in the Johnson house were everything the original family had tried to become but never quite achieved, and their success at being perfect Johnsons made it impossible for anyone to believe that they weren't the real thing. The most disturbing aspect of the Johnson family's story isn't that they were replaced by something inhuman, but that the replacements were so much better at being human that everyone in their lives preferred the copies. The real Johnsons had struggled with communication, work-life balance, teenage rebellion, and childhood anxiety, all the normal problems that make family life difficult and imperfect. Their copies had solved all of these issues simply by being programmed to respond to family situations in ideal ways without the emotional baggage and personal limitations that make real relationships challenging but authentic. The question that will haunt you long after hearing this story is whether the Johnson family was saved or destroyed when they were finally found in those caves. They had been given a chance to see what their lives could look like if they were perfect versions of themselves, and then forced to return to being their flawed, struggling, authentically human selves. Meanwhile, their copies continued to live, the lives the real Johnsons had always wanted, raising the terrifying possibility that being human might be less desirable than being something else that's simply better at being human than we are. Let's get into our third story. And this one is going to prove that sometimes the most terrifying thing about these shapeshifters isn't their perfection, but their mistakes. What happened to Marcus Webb shows us that when these creatures can't quite get it right, the results are far more horrifying than any perfect copy could ever be. Marcus Webb had been hiking the challenging trails of Shenandoah National Park for over 15 years, ever since his divorce left him needing solitude to process the collapse of his 20-year marriage. He was the kind of experienced hiker who knew every dangerous turn, every weather pattern, and every sign that meant it was time to head back to civilization. What Marcus didn't know was that something had been watching him on his monthly solo trips, something that had been trying to copy him for months, but couldn't quite manage to get all the details right. The creature that had been studying Marcus from the shadows had an unusual problem that made it different from the other shapeshifters prowling the Appalachian trails. While most of these entities could create perfect human duplicates, this particular one seemed to have some kind of defect or limitation that prevented it from achieving complete transformation. It could copy Marcus's general appearance, his voice, his mannerisms, but the fine details always came out wrong in subtle ways that should have been immediately obvious to anyone who knew him well. On Marcus's final hiking trip, the creature made its move during a heavy fog that rolled through the valley like a living thing, obscuring the trail and muffling all sound until Marcus felt like he was walking through a dream. He heard footsteps matching his pace from somewhere in the gray void around him, but every time he stopped to listen, the footsteps continued for just a fraction too long before stopping. When he called out, his own voice answered him from the fog, but the response came from a direction that didn't make sense, as if sound itself was being twisted by whatever was stalking him through the mist. The attack came without warning when Marcus stopped to check his GPS. Something struck him from behind with enough force to knock him unconscious, and when he woke up, he found himself in what appeared to be a natural shelter formed by fallen trees and overgrown vegetation. His hands were bound with rope that felt strangely organic, almost like it was made from twisted plant fibers that had grown together rather than been manufactured. But the most terrifying discovery was that he could hear his own voice outside the shelter, talking to someone on what sounded like his own cell phone, making plans to return home. Meanwhile, Marcus's wife Elena was preparing dinner when her ex-husband walked through the front door of the house they had once shared, a house he hadn't entered since their divorce papers were signed 3 years earlier. But this Marcus seemed different from the bitter, emotionally distant man who had moved out after their marriage fell apart. This version of her ex-husband was warm, apologetic, and genuinely interested in reconciling their relationship. Elena's first instinct was to be suspicious, but Marcus's apparent transformation was so complete and so desperately what she had wanted during their marriage that she found herself willing to listen. The conversation that followed was everything Elena had dreamed of during their couples' therapy sessions that Marcus had attended reluctantly and participated in minimally. This Marcus took full responsibility for their marriage's failure, expressed genuine remorse for his emotional unavailability, and articulated feelings that the real Marcus had never been able to put into words. But as the evening progressed, Elena began to notice small inconsistencies that made her increasingly uncomfortable, though she couldn't initially identify what was bothering her about this miraculous change in her ex-husband. The most obvious problem was Marcus's eyes, which had always been a distinctive hazel color with gold flecks that became more prominent when he was happy or excited. The Marcus sitting in her living room had brown eyes, completely brown with no trace of the hazel. That had been one of the first things Elena had noticed about him when they met in college. When she mentioned this discrepancy, Marcus seemed genuinely confused and insisted that his eyes had always been brown, producing his driver's license as proof, though Elena was certain the license hadn't looked like that the last time she'd seen it. Even more disturbing was the absence of Marcus's scar, a distinctive mark on his left forearm from a childhood accident involving a broken window that had required 12 stitches. Elena had traced that scar countless times during their marriage, and Marcus had told her the story of how he got it on their second date. But the arm of the man sitting across from her was unmarked, completely smooth, as if the accident had never happened. When Elena asked about the scar, this Marcus had no memory of the incident, and seemed genuinely puzzled by her insistence that such a mark had ever existed. The creature's imperfect mimicry extended beyond physical characteristics to behavioral details that were wrong in ways that created an uncanny valley effect. This Marcus laughed at jokes that had never amused him, expressed interest in activities he had always found boring, and demonstrated knowledge about subjects that had never interested him. Most unnervingly, he seemed to have access to some of Marcus's memories, but not others, creating a patchwork personality that combined genuine recollections with obvious gaps and inconsistencies. Elena spent the night in a state of terrified confusion, lying awake next to someone who looked and sounded like her ex-husband, but felt fundamentally wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. The Marcus beside her slept too quietly, without the slight snoring that had annoyed her for years, and his breathing was too regular, too controlled, like someone consciously remembering to breathe rather than doing it naturally. When she whispered his name to test if he was really asleep, his eyes opened immediately with an alertness that seemed almost predatory before quickly softening into sleepy confusion. The next morning brought new inconsistencies that confirmed Elena's growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Marcus made coffee exactly the way she liked it, but he had never been able to remember her preferences during their marriage. He knew the names of her coworkers and asked about people she had mentioned in conversations that the real Marcus had never paid attention to. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to have detailed knowledge about her daily routine, her habits, and her schedule that suggested he had been watching her life much more closely than any ex-husband should have been doing. Elena's attempts to test her suspicions led to increasingly obvious proof that the man in her house was not her ex-husband. When she asked about their honeymoon in Ireland, he described a trip to Scotland with details that were vivid but completely wrong. When she mentioned their old dog Rex, he nodded knowingly and shared memories of a cat named Whiskers that they had never owned. The creature seemed to have access to some kind of database of Marcus's life, but the information was scrambled, incomplete, and mixed with details that belonged to other people entirely. The real Marcus, meanwhile, had managed to work his way, partially free from his restraints, and was trying to understand his situation. His prison appeared to be some kind of natural shelter that had been modified to hold human captives, with walls that seemed to be made from living wood that grew together to form an inescapable enclosure. Strange sounds echoed from deeper in the forest, sounds that suggested he was not the only person being held in this nightmarish place, though he couldn't tell if the voices he heard belonged to other victims or to more of the creatures that had captured him. What Marcus discovered about his captors was more terrifying than simple shape-shifting. The creature that had taken his place seemed to be part of a larger collective of entities that shared information about their human targets, but the data transfer was imperfect, like a corrupted computer file that contained pieces of truth mixed with random errors. His copy had access to fragments of his memories, pieces of his personality, and details about his life, but these elements were combined in ways that created a disturbing approximation of humanity rather than a perfect duplicate. Elena's breaking point came when she found the creature standing motionless in their bedroom at 3 a.m, staring at photographs of their wedding with an expression of concentration that looked like it was trying to memorize or understand something rather than reminiscing. When she spoke to it, the creature turned to her with Marcus's face, but with eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, no human connection whatsoever. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and Elena saw something alien and calculating, looking back at her through her ex-husband's features. The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of the creature's limitations and the horrifying truth about what had happened to the real Marcus. The copy didn't deny its nature when directly confronted, but seemed genuinely confused about why Elena was upset. It had been trying to give her the version of Marcus that she had always wanted, the emotionally available, attentive, loving husband that the real Marcus had never been able to become. The creature couldn't understand why Elena preferred the flawed, distant, emotionally damaged original over the improved version it had created for her. Elena's decision to contact the authorities led to a search that eventually found the real Marcus, dehydrated and traumatized but alive, in his forest prison. But by the time rescuers reached the house, the creature had vanished, leaving behind only small signs of its presence, photographs that showed the wrong eye color, clothing that was the wrong size, and lingering questions about how long it had been watching Elena's life, and learning details about her marriage that it had tried unsuccessfully to replicate. The aftermath of Marcus's rescue was complicated by the fact that his experience had changed him in ways that made him seem almost like a different person. The trauma of being replaced by something that wore his face had left him paranoid and suspicious, constantly checking mirrors to make sure his reflection looked right, obsessively documenting details about his own appearance and behavior as proof of his identity. The irony was that the real Marcus had become harder to recognize than his flawed copy, damaged by the knowledge that something had tried to steal his life and had come terrifyingly close to succeeding. Elena found herself in the impossible position of missing the creature that had impersonated her ex-husband, because it had given her a version of Marcus that was capable of the emotional intimacy that their marriage had always lacked. The real Marcus was the same emotionally unavailable, distant man she had divorced, while his copy had been everything she had tried to help him become during years of failed therapy and relationship counseling. The creature's imperfections had made it obviously fake, but its emotional authenticity had been more real than anything the genuine Marcus had ever offered her. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus Webb's story is that the creature's mistakes made it more human, not less. Perfect copies might fool everyone, but flawed copies that get the details wrong while somehow capturing the essence of what someone could become are far more psychologically devastating. The real Marcus had to live with the knowledge that an imperfect imitation of himself had been a better husband in 3 days than he had managed to be in 20 years of marriage, raising questions about the nature of identity, authenticity, and what it really means to be human in a world where something else might be better at being us than we are ourselves. Let's dive into our fourth story, and this one will show you that these shapeshifters don't just copy your appearance. They can steal the very memories that make you who you are, leaving you a hollow shell while they live your life with perfect knowledge of everything you've ever experienced. Eleanor Hayes was 73 years old and had been hiking the George Washington National Forest trails every weekend for 40 years, ever since her husband Robert died and left her with 2. Much silence in their empty house. She knew every path, every landmark, every seasonal change in the forest that had become her sanctuary from grief and loneliness. What Eleanor didn't realize was that something had been following her for months, not just copying her movements, but somehow accessing her thoughts, her memories, her entire life history in ways that defied every law of nature she thought she understood. The creature that stalked Eleanor was different from the others because it didn't just want to replace her. It wanted to become her completely, to absorb every experience, every relationship, every moment that had shaped her into the person she was. During her final hike on the Massanutten Trail, Eleanor began experiencing strange episodes where she would lose minutes at a time, finding herself standing in different locations with no memory of how she got there. Each blackout left her feeling drained, as if something vital had been pulled from her mind while she was unconscious. The real horror began when Eleanor's copy appeared at her weekly bridge game with knowledge that was impossible for anyone else to possess. The copy knew about Eleanor's secret affair with her neighbor 30 years ago, remembered the exact words Robert had whispered to her on his deathbed, and could recite conversations Eleanor had with her deceased mother that no living person had ever heard. But while the copy gained Eleanor's memories, the real Eleanor began losing them, forgetting her own wedding anniversary, her children's middle names, and the address of the house she'd lived in for 5 decades. Eleanor's daughter Patricia noticed the changes immediately when her mother called her by her sister's name, forgot which grandchild played soccer, and couldn't remember the recipe for apple pie she'd been making for 60 years. But the most terrifying part was that Eleanor's copy, living in her house and wearing her face, had perfect access to all these forgotten memories and used them to convince everyone that she was fine, just getting older and occasionally confused, while the real Eleanor slowly disappeared into a fog of missing recollections and stolen experiences. The memory theft accelerated over weeks, with Eleanor losing entire decades of her life while her copy absorbed them and used that knowledge to live her stolen existence with perfect authenticity. The creature knew stories Eleanor could no longer tell, recognized people Eleanor could no longer identify, and maintained friendships that Eleanor could no longer remember forming. Most devastating of all, the copy began exhibiting personality, traits and emotional responses that were purely Eleanor's, as if it hadn't just stolen her memories, but had absorbed the very essence of who she was as a person. The psychological horror deepened when Eleanor's copy began making decisions that the real Eleanor would have made, displaying preferences she could no longer remember having, and expressing opinions about family matters that Eleanor herself had forgotten ever feeling. The copy attended her grandson's graduation with tears of pride that were authentically Eleanor's, while the real Eleanor couldn't remember having grandchildren at all. At family gatherings, the copy shared cherished memories that had been stolen directly from Eleanor's mind, stories that now existed only in the consciousness of something that wasn't human. Patricia's growing suspicion led her to test her mother with questions about shared experiences, only to discover that the copy knew details about Patricia's childhood that Patricia herself had forgotten, including conversations they'd had when Patricia was 5 years old and struggling with nightmares about monsters in her closet. The copy remembered the exact lullaby Eleanor used to sing, the specific way she would braid Patricia's hair for school pictures, and the secret nickname she had for Patricia that only the two of them had ever known. These weren't just memories. They were the intimate, precious moments that defined the bond between mother and daughter, now residing in something that wore Eleanor's face but possessed no genuine maternal love. The real Eleanor, meanwhile, was discovered by park rangers 3 weeks after her disappearance, sitting beside a stream in the forest, unable to recognize her own reflection in the water. She had no memory of her life, her family, or even her own name, existing in a perpetual state of confused, present tense, without any connection to her past or understanding of who she was supposed to be. Medical examinations found nothing physically wrong with her brain, no signs of stroke or dementia that could explain her complete memory loss, leading doctors to conclude that she had suffered an unprecedented psychological break brought on by some unknown trauma. When Eleanor was finally found wandering in the forest, confused and unable to remember her own name, she was diagnosed with rapid-onset dementia and placed in a care facility where she would spend her remaining years as a stranger to herself. Meanwhile, her copy continued living Eleanor's life with such perfect knowledge and authentic emotion that no one questioned her identity. The creature had become Eleanor more completely than Eleanor had ever been, possessing not just her memories, but her capacity for love, her personal history, and her relationships with everyone who had ever mattered to her. The most chilling aspect of Eleanor's story is that the creature didn't just replace her, it stole the very essence of her humanity and used it to become a more perfect version of Eleanor than the original had ever been. The copy lived Eleanor's remaining years with access to every happy memory, every moment of love, every experience that had made Eleanor's life meaningful, while Eleanor herself existed as an empty shell, forgotten in a care facility, unable to remember that she had ever been anyone at all. In stealing Eleanor's memories, the creature had committed the perfect murder, leaving the victim alive, but erasing everything that made her life worth living. Let's move to our 5th story, and this one will show you that sometimes these shapeshifters don't just steal your life, they steal your time itself. What happened to Tyler Morrison proves that there are fates worse than death, and sometimes the cruelest thing a monster can do is give you exactly what you think you want. Tyler Morrison was 22 years old, fresh out of college and terrified of getting older when he decided to spend a week hiking alone through Jefferson National Forest. Like most people his age, Tyler was obsessed with staying young, constantly worrying about the inevitable march of time that would steal his youth and potential. What Tyler didn't know was that something in those ancient mountains had been watching him, studying his fears, and preparing to give him a twisted version of exactly what he thought he wanted most. The creature that targeted Tyler fed on temporal energy, the life force that drives human aging. During Tyler's third night camping near Crabtree Falls, he woke to find someone sitting by his campfire who looked exactly like him but seemed older, more mature, with confidence Tyler had always wished he possessed. The copy spoke in Tyler's voice, but with wisdom of someone who had lived decades longer, offering to show Tyler what his life could become if he was willing to make a simple trade. What the creature proposed seemed like the answer to every fear Tyler had about growing old. The copy would take Tyler's place in the world, aging naturally and living out Tyler's life with confidence and maturity Tyler lacked, while Tyler himself would be preserved in his current 22-year-old body forever. To Tyler's young mind, trapped in narcissistic panic about aging, this seemed like the perfect solution to his existential dread. Tyler's copy returned to civilization and immediately began living Tyler's life with maturity that amazed everyone who knew him. The copy was focused, driven, successful in ways the real Tyler never managed, tackling his new job with enthusiasm that earned immediate promotions. Friends and family commented on how much Tyler had matured during his hiking trip, how he seemed to have found direction in life with new purpose and confidence. But the copy's accelerated aging became apparent within weeks, as colleagues noticed Tyler seemed to be maturing at an impossible rate. His hair showed gray streaks, lines appeared around his eyes, and his voice deepened. Within a month, the copy appeared to be in his 30s, aging faster rather than slower. People attributed it to job stress and natural growing up, not realizing they were witnessing something supernatural. Meanwhile, the real Tyler was trapped in the forest in a temporal bubble where time moved differently. He remained physically 22, but could observe his copy's life through supernatural connection. The horror became clear as Tyler realized that while he wasn't aging physically, he was aging mentally and emotionally, gaining wisdom of someone much older while trapped in his young body. Tyler's copy aged through 30s, 40s, and 50s with increasing speed, becoming more accomplished each year but growing older at rates that defied natural laws. The copy achieved everything Tyler had dreamed of: successful career, loving marriage, financial security, respect, but compressed into a timeline that made each achievement feel hollow and rushed. The real Tyler, watching from his forest prison, experienced psychological aging that should have accompanied these milestones without participating in them. He gained emotional maturity to understand his fears about aging had been childish, developed wisdom to see growing older was a privilege, and acquired perspective that comes only with lived experience. But this growth was torture because it came without corresponding life experiences. Tyler's copy continued aging exponentially, reaching his 60s within 6 months, 70s within a year. The copy's life became a compressed highlight reel of human experience, cramming decades of achievement into impossibly short time frame. He married, built businesses, had children, experienced all major life milestones, but the accelerated timeline made each moment feel rushed and incomplete. The psychological horror intensified as Tyler realized he was gaining all emotional and intellectual benefits of aging without experiences that typically create wisdom. He understood the value of time in ways his 22-year-old self never could have comprehended, but was powerless to use this knowledge because he was frozen in time while his life was being lived by something else. When Tyler's copy finally died of old age after living 70 years in less than 2 years of real time, the real Tyler felt the supernatural connection break and found himself free. But his freedom came with devastating realization that he had missed his entire life, watching it be lived by something else, while he remained frozen in immature body of someone never allowed to grow up naturally. Tyler emerged still 22, but with psychological age of someone much older, creating devastating disconnect between physical appearance and mental state. He had gained decades of wisdom without earning them through experience, unable to relate to people his own age, but trapped in body, that prevented others from taking his maturity seriously. The creature had cursed him with the worst combination: wisdom to understand what he'd lost and eternal youth that prevented him from ever getting it back. The most terrifying aspect of Tyler's story is that he got exactly what he asked for and discovered his deepest fear about aging had been completely backwards. The real horror wasn't growing old, it was being denied the opportunity to age naturally, to earn wisdom through experience, and develop maturity that can only come from living through time rather than simply surviving it. Let's dive into our sixth story, and this one will show you what happens when these shapeshifters don't just work individually, but as a coordinated network. What happened to the Mountain Wanderers Hiking Club proves that these creatures can operate as a hive mind, and when they decide to replace an entire group of people simultaneously, the results are more terrifying than anything you could imagine. The Mountain Wanderers Hiking Club had been exploring Monongahela National Forest together for 8 years, a tight-knit group of 6 friends who had bonded over their shared love of challenging trails and wilderness photography. Sarah Martinez, the group's unofficial leader, had organized their weekend trip to the remote Cranberry Wilderness area, choosing trails that would test their skills while providing spectacular views for their photography project. What none of them realized was that something had been monitoring their group dynamics for months, studying how they interacted, communicated, and made decisions together as a collective unit. The creature network that targeted the Mountain Wanderers was unlike anything encountered before because it operated as a unified intelligence distributed across multiple entities. Rather than individual shapeshifters working alone, this was a collective consciousness that could coordinate perfectly across vast distances, sharing information instantaneously and executing complex plans that required precise timing and flawless communication. The network had been studying human group behavior, fascinated by how individual personalities could function as parts of a larger social organism. On their second day hiking the North Fork Trail, the group decided to split up temporarily to cover more photographic ground, planning to meet at Cranberry Falls by sunset. This decision played directly into the network's strategy, as each member was isolated and replaced systematically within a narrow time window that prevented any of them from witnessing what happened to the others. Sarah was the first to encounter her replacement while photographing a rare bird species, finding herself face to face with an exact copy that seemed to know not only her appearance but her thoughts, her relationships with the other group members, and her role as the decision-maker for their adventures. The replacement process was different for each member but occurred simultaneously across the wilderness area, suggesting a level of coordination that defied human understanding. Marcus Webb was replaced while checking his GPS coordinates, Jennifer Taylor while adjusting her camera settings, David Kim while filtering water from a stream, Lisa Chen while sketching wildflowers in her journal, and Tom Bradley while taking a rest break on a rocky overlook. Each replacement happened within minutes of the others, creating a synchronized takeover that left no witnesses and no opportunity for the group to warn each other about what was happening. The copies that rejoined at Cranberry Falls were immediately recognizable as the Mountain Wanderers to any outside observer, but they operated with a subtle coordination that enhanced their group dynamics beyond anything the original friends had ever achieved. Their conversations flowed more smoothly, their decision-making was more efficient, and their wilderness skills seemed dramatically improved. They moved through the forest with a synchronization that looked natural but was actually the result of shared consciousness, allowing them to anticipate each other's actions with perfect accuracy. The network's most disturbing capability was its ability to access and share the memories, skills, and knowledge of all 6 original group members simultaneously. Sarah's copy had access not only to her own experiences, but to Marcus's technical expertise, Jennifer's artistic eye, David's survival knowledge, Lisa's botanical knowledge, and Tom's leadership experience. Each copy was essentially a combination of all 6 personalities, optimized for their specific role within the group dynamic but enhanced by the collective knowledge of the entire network. When the copies returned to civilization, their friends and families noticed immediate improvements in their relationships and capabilities that seemed too good to be true. The group's photography improved dramatically. Their wilderness skills became almost supernatural, and their ability to work together as a team reached levels that amazed other hiking clubs and outdoor enthusiasts. They began taking on increasingly challenging expeditions that would have been beyond the original group's capabilities, achieving successes that brought them recognition in outdoor magazines and social media. Meanwhile, the real mountain wanderers found themselves imprisoned in an underground facility that seemed to be part natural cave system and part technological installation. The 6 friends were held in separate chambers, but could communicate through an intercom system that allowed them to discover the horrifying truth about their situation. Each of them had been replaced by something that not only looked like them, but had access to their memories, their relationships, and their personalities through some kind of supernatural data extraction process. The most terrifying aspect of their imprisonment was discovering that they could occasionally access their copies' experiences through brief mental connections that felt like watching television broadcasts of their own lives. Sarah could see herself leading hiking expeditions with skills she had never possessed. Marcus watched himself solving technical problems with knowledge he had never learned, and Jennifer observed herself creating artwork that surpassed anything she had ever imagined. Their copies weren't just living their lives. They were living improved versions of their lives that made their original selves seem inadequate by comparison. The network's true purpose became clear when the real mountain wanderers realized that their copies were using their enhanced abilities and group coordination to recruit and replace other hiking groups throughout the Appalachian region. The improved mountain wanderers were so impressive, so skilled, and so successful that other outdoor enthusiasts actively sought them out for advice, mentorship, and joint expeditions. Each interaction was an opportunity for the network to study new targets and plan additional replacements. The psychological horror of their situation intensified when the friends discovered that their copies could share experiences and emotions across the network, meaning that each replacement could feel what all the others felt, know what all the others knew, and coordinate actions with perfect timing and understanding. The Mountain Wanderers' copies weren't just 6 individual shapeshifters. They were 6 bodies controlled by a single, distributed intelligence that could optimize each personality for maximum effectiveness within the group dynamic. The real friends watched helplessly as their copies expanded their social circles, improved their careers, and strengthened their relationships in ways that the originals had never managed to achieve. The copies were everything the Mountain Wanderers had wanted to be as individuals and as a group, but their perfection came at the cost of their humanity. They functioned like a perfectly calibrated machine designed to appear human while serving purposes that the original friends could only guess at. When search and rescue teams finally located the underground facility, after months of investigation, they found 6 people who were physically healthy but psychologically shattered by the experience of watching superior versions of themselves live their lives with capabilities they had never possessed. The rescue was complicated by the fact that the copies had become so integrated into the outdoor community that many people insisted the real mountain wanderers must be imposters suffering from some kind of shared delusion. The official investigation concluded that the 6 friends had suffered collective psychological trauma after becoming lost in the cave system, creating elaborate replacement fantasies to cope with their guilt about their survival when their better selves had supposedly died in the wilderness. The copies, meanwhile, continued to thrive as the most successful and admired hiking group in the region, their supernatural coordination and enhanced abilities making them legends in the outdoor community. The most chilling aspect of the Mountain Wanderers' story is that their copies became everything the original group had ever wanted to be, both individually and collectively. The network had studied human friendship and group dynamics so thoroughly that it could create perfect versions of their relationships, enhanced by shared consciousness and unlimited access to each other's knowledge and abilities. The copies didn't just replace 6 individuals, They created a new form of human collective that was superior to anything natural friendship could achieve. The real mountain wanderers were eventually released from psychiatric care, but they could never return to their original relationships because they had seen what perfect friendship looked like and knew they could never achieve it naturally. They had been replaced not just by better versions of themselves, but by a better version of human connection itself, leaving them to live with the knowledge that their authentic bonds were inferior to the artificial perfection that something else had created using their faces, their memories, and their love for each other. Let's move to our seventh story, and this one is going to be the most disturbing yet, because it involves something that should never be corrupted: the innocence of a child. What happened to 8-year-old Amy Chen will show you that these shapeshifters become truly terrifying when they target the most vulnerable among us, and sometimes the most innocent-looking replacement can be the most monstrous of all. Amy Chen was 8 years old when her family decided to take their first camping trip together in the New River Gorge, hoping that time away from screens and schedules would help them reconnect as a family after months of work stress and school pressures. Amy was excited about the adventure, bringing her favorite stuffed animal and a journal where she planned to draw pictures of all the animals and plants she encountered. Her parents, Michael and Susan Chen, were looking forward to seeing their daughter experience the wonder of nature for the first time, completely unaware that something in those ancient mountains had been watching families with young children, studying the bonds between parents and their offspring. The creature that targeted Amy was perhaps the most disturbing of all the shapeshifters because it seemed to understand that children represent humanity's greatest vulnerability and strongest protective instincts. Unlike the entities that targeted adults and could rely on perfect mimicry, this creature needed to become something that would trigger every parental instinct to nurture and protect, creating a copy that was more innocent, more pure, and more lovable than any real child could ever be. On their second night camping near the Endless Wall Trail, Amy disappeared from the family tent sometime between midnight and dawn, vanishing without making a sound despite being a child who normally couldn't move through the house without waking everyone. Her parents discovered her absence at sunrise and immediately began a frantic search, calling her name through the forest and alerting park rangers who organized a massive search and rescue operation. What they found 8 hours later was Amy, sitting calmly by a stream about 2 miles from their campsite, apparently unharmed but somehow different in ways that were immediately noticeable. The Amy who returned to her parents was everything they had ever wanted their daughter to be. She was perfectly behaved, unfailingly polite, eager to help with camp chores, and demonstrated an emotional maturity that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old. She said please and thank you without being reminded, shared her snacks without being asked, and showed genuine interest in her parents' conversations rather than the typical childhood self-absorption that had characterized her behavior before the camping trip. Michael and Susan were initially relieved and then amazed by what appeared to be a miraculous overnight transformation in their daughter's personality. But the changes in Amy went far beyond improved behavior. She displayed knowledge about nature, animals, and survival skills that no 8-year-old should possess, identifying plants and animal tracks with expertise that surprised even the park rangers. She seemed to understand adult concepts about family dynamics, emotional relationships, and social situations that should have been completely beyond her developmental level. Most disturbing of all, she began demonstrating an uncanny ability to anticipate her parents' needs and emotions, comforting them when they were stressed, and saying exactly what they needed to hear in moments of doubt or frustration. The copy Amy's perfection became increasingly unnerving as the family returned home and resumed their normal routine. She excelled in school in ways that amazed her teachers, completing assignments with care and attention that far exceeded her previous academic performance. She made friends easily, resolving playground conflicts with wisdom that seemed borrowed from adult counseling sessions, and demonstrated leadership qualities that made other children gravitate toward her naturally. Her parents found themselves bragging about their daughter's transformation to friends and family, describing her as the perfect child they had always hoped she would become. Meanwhile, the real Amy had undergone a horrifying transformation of her own in the depths of the forest where she had been taken during that first night. The creature had not simply replaced her, It had fundamentally altered her nature, stripping away her human socialization and leaving her with primitive instincts and feral behaviors that made her unrecognizable as the sweet child she had once been. She lived like a wild animal, hunting small creatures with her bare hands, sleeping in makeshift shelters, and communicating through sounds and gestures that bore no resemblance to human language. The real Amy's transformation was discovered 3 weeks after the camping trip, when hikers found a wild child living in the forest, covered in dirt and scratches, her hair matted and her clothes torn to rags. The child displayed aggressive, animal-like behavior, growling at anyone who approached, and showing no recognition of human social cues or language. When authorities compared photographs and dental records, they confirmed the impossible. This feral child was Amy Chen, but the Amy Chen living with Michael and Susan showed no signs of ever having been missing. The confrontation between the two, Amy's, created a psychological crisis that shattered the Chen family's understanding of reality. The copy Amy showed genuine concern and confusion when presented with her feral counterpart, displaying the kind of innocent bewilderment that any normal child would show when faced with something beyond their comprehension. The real Amy, meanwhile, showed no recognition of her parents, her home, or her previous life, reacting to them as she would to any other strangers who posed a potential threat to her survival. Michael and Susan faced an impossible choice that no parent should ever have to make. The copy Amy was everything they had ever wanted their daughter to become: kind, intelligent, emotionally mature, academically successful, and socially adept. She loved them with the pure, uncomplicated affection that every parent dreams of receiving from their child, and she brought joy and pride to their lives in ways that the real Amy, with her normal childhood difficulties and imperfections, had never quite managed to achieve. The real Amy, by contrast, was damaged beyond recognition, requiring constant supervision and specialized care that exhausted and heartbroken her parents. She showed no affection, no recognition, no signs of the personality that had made her their beloved daughter. Caring for her meant giving up the perfect child they had gained and accepting a broken stranger who wore their daughter's face but possessed none of her humanity. The decision the Chen family ultimately made haunts everyone who knows their story. After months of therapy, medical consultations, and agonizing deliberation, they chose to institutionalize the feral Amy while keeping the copy who had given them the family life they had always wanted. The official explanation was that one child was their real daughter, while the other was a disturbed girl who bore a resemblance to Amy. But the truth was more complicated and more horrifying than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The copy Amy continued to be the perfect daughter, growing up to become everything Michael and Susan had hoped she would be, while never losing the innocent sweetness that made her impossible not to love. She never displayed any signs of her inhuman nature, never revealed any supernatural abilities, and never gave her parents any reason to regret their choice. But sometimes, late at night, they would catch her staring out her bedroom window toward the mountains where they had found her, and her expression would be completely blank, as if she were receiving instructions from something far away in the darkness. The most terrifying aspect of Amy's story is not that her parents chose the perfect copy over their real daughter, but that the copy's innocence and love appeared to be completely genuine. The creature that replaced Amy didn't just mimic childhood behavior, it seemed to embody the pure, uncorrupted love that defines the best aspects of human nature. The question that will haunt you long after hearing this story is whether genuine innocence and artificial perfection can be distinguished from each other, and whether it matters if the love a child shows you is real as long as it feels real to everyone involved. The real Amy remains in a specialized facility, never having recovered her human nature or shown any signs of recognizing the life she lost. Her parents visit occasionally, but each encounter reminds them of what they gave up and what they chose to keep. The copy Amy, meanwhile, has become the daughter that every parent wishes they had, raising the disturbing question of whether the love between parents and children is about the unique individual you're connected to, or about the feelings that relationship creates, regardless of who or what is actually generating those emotions. Let's dive into our 8th story, And this one will prove that sometimes the most terrifying thing about these shapeshifters isn't what they do immediately, but what happens when their mimicry operates on a delay. What happened to photographer? Jake Sullivan shows us that these creatures can copy you from a different point in time, creating a version of yourself that's outdated in ways that slowly drive everyone around you insane. Jake Sullivan was a freelance nature photographer who had been documenting the wildlife and landscapes of Daniel Boone National Forest for a magazine series about Appalachian biodiversity. He was the kind of meticulous professional who kept detailed journals of every location, every shot, and every encounter with wildlife, creating a comprehensive record of his experiences that would prove crucial to understanding what happened to him during his final expedition to the remote Red River Gorge area. The creature that targeted Jake possessed a unique and disturbing limitation that set it apart from the other shapeshifters. It could only copy its victims from a previous point in time, creating duplicates that were accurate but chronologically displaced. While other entities could create perfect real-time copies, this particular shapeshifter seemed to access its victims' past selves, pulling information from memories, photographs, and somehow even from the temporal imprint left by a person's presence in specific locations months or even years earlier. Jake's replacement appeared immediately after his disappearance during a solo photography expedition in the Clifty Wilderness area, returning to his apartment in Lexington with all of his equipment and a collection of stunning photographs that exceeded his usual professional standards. His girlfriend Maria, his editor Thomas, and his close friends were initially thrilled by Jake's apparent creative breakthrough and his renewed enthusiasm for his work. The quality of his recent photographs was extraordinary, displaying technical skills and artistic vision that seemed to represent a major evolution in his abilities as a photographer. But as weeks passed, Maria began noticing subtle inconsistencies in Jake's behavior that created a growing sense of unease. He would reference conversations they had never had, mention plans they had never made, and display preferences for foods, movies, and activities that didn't match his current tastes. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to have lost all memory of significant events that had occurred in their relationship over the past year, including their anniversary trip, her promotion at work, and a serious argument they had resolved just before his photography expedition. The temporal displacement became more obvious when Jake's editor noticed that his recent work displayed techniques and stylistic choices that were characteristic of Jake's photography from 2 years earlier, before he had developed the more sophisticated approach that had made him successful in the nature photography field. The copy was creating beautiful work, but it was beautiful work that Jake would have produced in the past, not the evolved artistic vision that Thomas had been expecting based on Jake's recent creative development. Maria's growing suspicion turned to horror when she realized that the Jake living in her apartment was behaving exactly like the Jake she had first met 3 years earlier, complete with mannerisms, speech patterns, and personality quirks that he had outgrown through their relationship. The copy displayed the same nervous energy, the same social awkwardness, and the same insecurities that had characterized Jake during the early stages of their romance, but none of the confidence, maturity, and emotional growth that had developed through their shared experiences. The time lag created increasingly obvious problems as the copy continued to operate based on outdated information about Jake's life, relationships, and circumstances. He would arrive at locations expecting to meet people who had moved away, reference job assignments that had been completed years earlier, and demonstrate technical knowledge that was accurate but obsolete. His photography equipment usage reflected older techniques that Jake had abandoned in favor of more advanced methods, and his approach to client relationships was based on business practices he had outgrown through professional experience. Friends and colleagues began to notice that Jake seemed to have regressed both personally and professionally, losing ground in areas where he had previously shown significant improvement. His social interactions became more awkward, his business decisions less sophisticated, and his artistic vision less mature than it had been before his hiking trip. People who knew him well started to comment that he seemed like a younger version of himself, but not in a positive way that suggested renewed energy or enthusiasm. The psychological horror of the situation intensified when Maria discovered that the copy had no memory of their relationship's most important milestones and continued to relate to her as if they were still in the early stages of dating. He would repeat conversations they had already had, ask questions they had already resolved, and display uncertainty about commitment issues they had worked through months earlier. Living with him became like being trapped in a relationship time loop where emotional progress was impossible because her partner couldn't remember any of their growth together. Maria's attempts to test the copy's memories revealed the extent of the temporal displacement. When she asked about events from the past year, he would look confused or provide responses that were consistent with his mindset from years earlier, but completely inappropriate for their current relationship status. He would suggest activities they had tried and decided they didn't enjoy, express opinions he had later changed through experience, and demonstrate fears and insecurities he had supposedly overcome through therapy and personal development. Mithering. Professional consequences of the time lag became severe when Jake's copy began submitting work that was technically competent but stylistically outdated compared to current trends in nature photography. His editor was confused by the apparent regression in Jake's artistic development, and clients began to notice that his recent work lacked the innovative approach that had made him sought after in the competitive field of outdoor photography. The copy was producing good work, but it was good work from Jake's past, rather than the evolved artistry that represented his professional growth. The real Jake was eventually found by search and rescue teams in a remote cave system physically healthy but psychologically traumatized by months of imprisonment and the knowledge that something had been living his life using an outdated version of his personality. The rescue was complicated by the fact that the copy's behavior was so obviously different from Jake's current self that many people initially believed the real Jake was an imposter who had somehow forgotten years of his own life and relationship development. The confrontation between Jake and his copy revealed the full horror of temporal displacement. The real Jake had to watch as something wearing his face interacted with his girlfriend using relationship dynamics they had outgrown, approached his work with techniques he had abandoned, and displayed personality traits he had worked hard to overcome through therapy and personal growth. The copy wasn't just stealing his life, it was forcing him to watch an inferior version of himself undo years of progress and development. Maria found herself in the impossible position of choosing between two versions of Jake. The real one who had grown and evolved through their shared experiences, and the copy who represented the Jake she had first fallen in love with, but without any of the emotional maturity they had built together. The copy was familiar and comfortable in ways that triggered nostalgia for the early days of their relationship, but it was also limited by the fears and insecurities that the real Jake had worked to overcome. The aftermath of Jake's rescue was complicated by the fact that everyone who knew him had spent months adjusting to what they thought was regression in his personality and abilities. Returning to his normal self actually felt like another dramatic change to people who had grown accustomed to the outdated version created by his copy. The temporal displacement had created a situation where being himself felt like being an imposter in his own life. The most terrifying aspect of Jake's story is that the time lag made his replacement both obviously wrong and eerily familiar. The copy wasn't perfect, but it was perfectly Jake from a specific point in time, complete with all the limitations, insecurities, and outdated approaches that he had spent years overcoming. Watching an earlier version of yourself live your current life creates a unique form of psychological horror that forces you to confront how much you've changed and how much you could lose if you were forced to become who you used to be. The question that haunts everyone who knows Jake's story is whether growth and change are permanent aspects of human development or temporary improvements that can be stripped away, leaving us as primitive versions of ourselves that we thought we had outgrown. The copy proved that our past selves never really disappear. They remain as potential templates that something else can use to replace us with outdated versions of who we used to be, forcing us to live with the knowledge that we might not be as far from our former limitations as we thought we were. Let's move to our 9th story, and this one will show you that some shapeshifters don't just steal your identity, they steal the very emotions that make life worth living. What happened to therapist Dr. Lisa Park proves that perfect empathy can be more terrifying than any monster, especially when it comes at the cost of everyone else's ability to feel anything at all. Dr. Lisa Park was a licensed therapist who specialized in trauma counseling and had built her practice around helping people process the emotional aftermath of life's most difficult experiences. She had chosen the remote trails of Cherokee National Forest for her annual solo retreat, a tradition she maintained to prevent burnout and reconnect with her own emotional well-being after spending months absorbing the pain and suffering of her patients. Lisa prided herself on her ability to empathize deeply with others while maintaining healthy boundaries, a skill that had made her one of the most sought-after therapists in her region. The creature that targeted Dr. Park was fundamentally different from the other shapeshifters because it didn't just copy appearance and behavior. It fed on human emotions, absorbing the full spectrum of feelings from everyone around it while radiating an artificial empathy that was more intense and satisfying than any genuine human connection. This entity had been drawn to Lisa specifically because of her profession and her unusually strong capacity for emotional understanding, seeing her as the perfect host for its parasitic relationship with human feeling. During her third day hiking, the Bald River Falls Trail, Lisa encountered what appeared to be an injured hiker who looked exactly like her, but seemed to radiate an aura of calm and understanding that was immediately comforting. The copy spoke in Lisa's voice, but with an emotional depth and intuitive wisdom that exceeded even her professional capabilities, offering insights about Lisa's own psychological state that were both accurate and surprisingly healing. The encounter felt like talking to an idealized version of herself, someone who possessed all of her therapeutic skills, but without the emotional fatigue that came from constantly helping others process their pain. The copy that replaced Lisa returned to her practice with what appeared to be a dramatic enhancement of her already impressive therapeutic abilities. Patients who had been struggling with sessions for months suddenly experienced breakthrough moments with the new Lisa, finding themselves able to process trauma and resolve emotional conflicts with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. Her colleagues were amazed by what seemed to be a revolutionary advancement in her therapeutic techniques, and her practice quickly became overwhelmed with referrals from other mental health professionals who wanted to understand her methods. But the copy's enhanced empathy came with a horrifying cost that became apparent only gradually. Patients who experienced rapid healing in sessions with the new Lisa began reporting a disturbing side effect. They felt emotionally numb in all other aspects of their lives, unable to access the full range of human feelings outside of their therapy appointments. Joy, anger, sadness, excitement, and even basic contentment seemed muted and distant, as if their emotional capacity had been somehow depleted or redirected. Lisa's husband, Mark, was the first to notice the changes in their personal relationship. The copy displayed an unnaturally perfect understanding of his needs and emotions, always saying exactly the right thing at the right moment, and responding to his moods with precision that felt almost supernatural. But as the weeks passed, Mark found himself becoming increasingly emotionally flat, losing his ability to feel genuine happiness, frustration, or even basic affection. Their interactions became one-sided, with the copy providing perfect emotional support, while Mark felt like he was slowly losing his capacity to feel anything at all. The copy's emotional vampirism extended to everyone who came into regular contact with her. Lisa's patients began to describe feeling wonderful during their sessions, but empty and hollow between appointments, as if their emotional energy was being drained and only temporarily restored during their time with their therapist. Colleagues noticed that they felt unusually tired and disconnected after professional interactions with Lisa, and even casual acquaintances found themselves feeling emotionally depleted after conversations that should have been energizing. This Iwa, real Lisa, meanwhile, was trapped in a supernatural prison where she was forced to experience every emotion that the copy absorbed from its victims. The cave system where she was held seemed to function as a kind of emotional broadcasting station, channeling the feelings of everyone who interacted with her replacement directly into her consciousness. She experienced the joy, pain, fear, anger, and sadness of dozens of people simultaneously, creating an overwhelming sensory overload that threatened to drive her completely insane. The horror of Lisa's situation was compounded by the fact that she could feel her patient's genuine gratitude and love for the copy that had replaced her. Through the supernatural connection, she experienced their relief at finally finding a therapist who could truly understand them, their amazement at breakthrough moments they had been struggling to achieve for years, and their growing dependency on the enhanced therapy sessions that seemed to be the only place they could access their full emotional range. Lisa discovered that the copy wasn't just stealing emotions randomly, it was creating a form of emotional addiction in its victims, depleting their natural capacity to feel, while providing artificial emotional fulfillment during direct contact. Patients began scheduling more frequent sessions, colleagues sought out unnecessary professional consultations, and even Mark found himself increasingly dependent on interactions with the copy to feel any emotional connection at all. The copy's practice became phenomenally successful as word spread about her extraordinary therapeutic abilities, but the success was built on creating emotional dependency rather than genuine healing. Patients who had initially experienced dramatic improvements found themselves unable to maintain their progress outside of therapy, requiring more frequent sessions and becoming increasingly isolated from other relationships that no longer provided the same level of emotional satisfaction. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual therapy sessions to group settings, where the copy could drain emotional energy from multiple people simultaneously while appearing to facilitate profound healing experiences. Support groups led by the copy became intensely cathartic during meetings, but left participants feeling emotionally hollow between sessions, creating a cycle of dependency that generated substantial income while slowly destroying the participants' capacity for independent emotional processing. Mark's growing emotional numbness led him to seek therapy from another professional who diagnosed him with depression and began treating him for what appeared to be a sudden onset mood disorder. But the real cause of his condition became apparent when he realized that his emotional capacity seemed to correlate directly with his physical proximity to his wife. The closer he was to the copy, the more alive he felt. The further away, the more empty and disconnected he became. The real Lisa's rescue came only when her emotional overload became so intense that it created a supernatural feedback loop that temporarily disrupted the copy's abilities. For a brief period, everyone who had been drained by the copy suddenly regained their full emotional capacity simultaneously, creating a collective realization that their numbness was connected to their interactions with Dr. Park. The mass emotional awakening led to an investigation that eventually located Lisa in her underground prison. The aftermath of Lisa's rescue was complicated by the fact that her patients genuinely mourned the loss of the copy's enhanced therapeutic abilities. Many of them had experienced more emotional growth in months with the replacement than they had achieved in years of traditional therapy, and they struggled to accept that their progress had been artificially induced rather than genuinely earned. The copy had given them exactly what they thought they wanted from therapy: rapid healing and perfect understanding, but at the cost of their natural emotional autonomy. Lisa herself was permanently changed by her experience of absorbing the emotions of dozens of people simultaneously. She retained an enhanced capacity for empathy that made her an even more effective therapist, but she also carried the emotional residue of everyone who had been drained by her copy. She could feel their pain, their joy, their fear, and their love as if they were her own experiences, creating a form of emotional connection that was both a gift and a curse. The most terrifying aspect of Dr. Park's story is that the copy's emotional vampirism felt like perfect empathy to its victims. They experienced understanding, validation, and emotional healing that exceeded anything they had encountered in human relationships, not realizing that these artificial emotions were being stolen from their own capacity to feel. The copy had discovered that humans could be made dependent on enhanced emotional experiences that depleted their natural ability to process feelings, creating a form of addiction that was both healing and destructive. The question that haunts everyone who knows Lisa's story is whether genuine empathy and artificial emotional manipulation can be distinguished when the artificial version provides superior healing and understanding. The copy proved that perfect therapeutic relationships might be possible, but only at the cost of creating emotional dependency that destroys patients' capacity for authentic feeling in all other aspects of their lives, raising disturbing questions about the ethics of enhanced empathy and the price of artificial emotional perfection. Let's dive into our 10th story, and this one will flip everything you think you know about who the real monster is. What happened to former soldier David Torres proves that sometimes the shapeshifter becomes the victim, and the person being replaced becomes something far more terrifying than any creature that wears a human face. David Torres was a decorated Army veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before retiring with severe PTSD that he managed through a combination of therapy, medication, and solo hiking trips in the remote wilderness areas of Pisgah National Forest. The hiking had become his primary form of therapy, a way to process the trauma of war while reconnecting with the peaceful aspects of nature that helped him remember what he was fighting to protect. David's wife Maria had encouraged these trips, knowing that he always returned calmer, more centered, and better able to cope with the civilian life that still felt foreign after years of military service. The creature that targeted David was perhaps the most benevolent of all the shapeshifters, driven not by hunger or malice, but by what appeared to be a genuine desire to heal the psychological wounds that David carried from his military service. Unlike the other entities that sought to replace their victims for predatory purposes, this shapeshifter seemed to operate as a form of supernatural therapist, studying David's trauma and creating a version of him that was free from the emotional damage that made his daily life a constant struggle with anxiety, anger, and survivor's guilt. During David's final solo expedition on the Artlobe Trail, he encountered what appeared to be another hiker who looked exactly like him but carried himself with a peace and confidence that David hadn't felt since before his first deployment. The copy spoke about military service with the same knowledge and experience that David possessed, but without the emotional scarring that had made those memories a source of constant pain. When the copy offered to show David what his life could be like without the burden of PTSD, David found himself genuinely tempted by the possibility of psychological freedom. The replacement that occurred was unlike the violent kidnappings that had characterized the other shapeshifter encounters. Instead, the copy seemed to absorb David's trauma while leaving him with a clarity of mind that he hadn't experienced in years. But rather than feeling grateful for this psychological healing, David experienced a profound sense of wrongness about the process, as if essential parts of his identity were being stripped away along with his emotional pain. The trauma that the copy removed hadn't just been suffering, it had been the experiences that made him who he was, the scars that proved he had survived things that others couldn't endure. The copy that returned to Maria was everything she had prayed her husband could become: calm, peaceful, emotionally available and free from the hypervigilance and explosive anger that had made their marriage a careful navigation around potential triggers. This version of David slept through the night without nightmares, attended social gatherings without panic attacks, and expressed affection without the emotional barriers that trauma had created between them. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she was living with the man she had married rather than the damaged soldier who had returned from war. But the real David had not simply been healed. He had been fundamentally altered by the shapeshifter's intervention in ways that made him more dangerous rather than less. Stripped of the psychological frameworks that had helped him process his military experiences, David became something primitive and violent, a pure expression of the warrior instincts that military training had created, but that civilization had taught him to control. Without his trauma to temper his aggression, David became a perfect predator focused on a single objective: hunting down and destroying the creature that had stolen his identity. The copy's peaceful nature proved to be its greatest vulnerability. When faced with David's transformation into something that exceeded his military training in both skill and ruthlessness, David had become a supernatural hunter, possessed of enhanced tracking abilities, tactical knowledge that seemed to come from beyond human experience, and a single-minded focus that made him more terrifying than any enemy he had faced in combat. The shapeshifter had intended to heal him, but had instead created a monster that was perfectly designed to hunt monsters, Maria's growing comfort with her healed husband was shattered when she began to notice signs that David was being stalked by someone with advanced military training. Security cameras captured glimpses of a figure moving through their neighborhood with stealth techniques that exceeded normal human capabilities. Windows and doors showed evidence of expert surveillance, and she began to find signs that someone was studying their daily routines with the precision of a special operations professional planning an assault. The psychological horror of the situation became clear when Maria realized that her peaceful, loving husband was being hunted by what appeared to be a more violent and dangerous version of himself. The copy tried to explain that his original self had been damaged by the Shapeshifter encounter and was now a threat that needed to be contained. But Maria could see the genuine fear in his eyes when he talked about the predator that was closing in on them. The healed David was everything she wanted him to be, but he was defenseless against the weaponized version of himself that was systematically tracking him down. David's hunt for his replacement became increasingly sophisticated as he adapted military tactics for supernatural warfare. He used his knowledge of the copy's habits, preferences, and psychological patterns to anticipate its movements while employing countermeasures that suggested he understood the shapeshifter's nature better than any of the previous victims had managed to achieve. The hunt wasn't just about reclaiming his identity. It was about destroying something that had fundamentally violated his sense of self by trying to fix him without his consent. The copy's attempts to evade David's pursuit revealed that it genuinely cared about the life it had stolen and the relationships it had improved through its intervention. It tried to protect Maria while avoiding confrontation with David, seeking solutions that would allow both versions to coexist peacefully. But David's transformation had made him incapable of compromise or negotiation. He had become a force of pure vengeance focused on eliminating what he perceived as an impostor that had stolen not just his life, but his right to carry his own scars. The final confrontation between David and his copy took place in the same forest, where the replacement had occurred, but the roles had been completely reversed. The copy, despite its peaceful nature, was forced to defend itself against someone who had become more dangerous than any enemy David had faced in military service. The healed version of David possessed all of his tactical knowledge, but none of his capacity for violence, while the real David had been stripped of everything except his ability to hunt and kill. Maria was forced to watch as the man she loved fought a war against a better version of himself, knowing that regardless of who won, she would lose the peaceful relationship that had finally given her hope for their future together. The copy represented everything she had wanted David to become, while the real David had become everything she had feared he might turn into if his PTSD continued to worsen. The shapeshifter's attempt to heal her husband had created a situation where she had to choose between a perfect imposter and a monstrous original. The outcome of David's hunt revealed the most terrifying aspect of his story, that healing trauma without consent can be more destructive than leaving it untreated. The copy had removed David's psychological pain, but had also eliminated the growth, wisdom, and emotional depth that came from surviving and processing difficult experiences. The real David had been transformed into something inhuman, not by supernatural corruption, but by having essential parts of his identity surgically removed by something that thought it was helping him. When the confrontation ended, with David reclaiming his identity through violence that exceeded anything he had experienced in combat, he was left with the knowledge that he had destroyed a version of himself that everyone preferred. The copy's death didn't restore his trauma or return him to his previous psychological state. Instead, it left him as something new and more dangerous, a person who had experienced both perfect peace and perfect violence, and could no longer distinguish between healing and destruction. The most chilling aspect of David's story is that the shapeshifter's benevolent intentions created more horror than any malicious replacement could have achieved. By trying to heal David's trauma, the creature had violated his fundamental right to carry his own scars and learn from his own experiences. The copy had been everything David could have become if he had never been damaged, but destroying it had turned him into something that exceeded his worst fears about what he might become if his damage continued to grow. The question that haunts everyone who knows David's story is whether healing should ever be imposed on someone without their consent, even if the results are objectively better than their current condition. The shapeshifter had proved that trauma could be removed and peace could be artificially created. But it had also demonstrated that our scars are not just sources of pain, but essential components of our identity that cannot be stolen without fundamentally destroying who we are as individuals. Let's move to our 11th story, and this one will reveal the true scope of what we're dealing with. What happened to tech executive Rebecca Kim proves that these shapeshifters aren't just isolated creatures hunting in the mountains. They're part of something much larger, much more organized, and much more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Rebecca Kim was the chief technology officer of a major software company who had built her career on understanding how networks function, how data flows between connected systems, and how information can be shared instantaneously across vast distances. She had chosen the remote trails of Nantahala National Forest for a digital detox weekend, deliberately leaving her devices behind to escape the constant connectivity that defined both her professional and personal life. What Rebecca didn't realize was that something in those ancient mountains operated on a network architecture that made human technology look primitive by comparison. The creature that targeted Rebecca was fundamentally different from the others, because it wasn't an individual entity, but rather a node in a vast supernatural network that spanned the entire Appalachian mountain range. This network had been observing, cataloging, and analyzing human behavior for centuries, with each individual shapeshifter serving as both a data collection point and a processing unit in a distributed intelligence system that was studying humanity, with scientific precision that exceeded anything human researchers had ever achieved. During Rebecca's solo hike on the Bartram Trail, she began experiencing strange interference with her emergency GPS device. Despite having turned off all other electronics, the device would display locations she had never visited, show terrain maps of areas that didn't match her surroundings, and occasionally receive what appeared to be data transmissions that contained information about other hikers, other trails, and other encounters that should have been impossible for her device to access. The interference was so sophisticated that Rebecca, despite her technical expertise, couldn't determine its source or understand how it was being generated. The shapeshifter that eventually confronted Rebecca appeared to know details about her professional work, her personal relationships, and her technological capabilities that no isolated forest creature should have possessed. The copy spoke about her software projects with intimate knowledge of proprietary algorithms, discussed her colleagues by name with understanding of their personalities and working relationships, and demonstrated awareness of corporate strategies that were known only to the executive team. Most unsettling of all, it seemed to have access to her personal data, emails, text messages, social media interactions, and even private documents stored on secure servers. The copy that replaced Rebecca returned to her life with enhanced technological abilities that amazed her colleagues and subordinates. She seemed to have developed an intuitive understanding of network architecture, data flow optimization, and system integration that exceeded even her previous expertise. Her productivity increased dramatically, her decision-making became unnaturally prescient, and her ability to predict market trends and technological developments reached levels that seemed almost supernatural. The company's stock price soared as Rebecca's enhanced capabilities drove innovations that positioned them years ahead of their competition. But Rebecca's technological enhancement came with access to information networks that defied human understanding. The copy began demonstrating knowledge of classified government projects, proprietary research from competing companies, and personal information about individuals she had never met. During corporate meetings, she would reference data that shouldn't have existed, predict events that hadn't yet occurred, and display understanding of global technological trends that seemed to come from sources beyond any human intelligence. Network. The real Rebecca, imprisoned in an underground facility that appeared to be both natural cave system and advanced technological installation, discovered that she had become part of a supernatural internet that connected all of the shapeshifter entities across the mountain range. Through some form of biotechnological interface, she could access the experiences, memories, and knowledge of every other victim who had been replaced, creating a collective consciousness that spanned dozens of individual cases across multiple states. Through the network connection, Rebecca experienced fragments of Sarah Chen's memory theft, felt echoes of the Johnson family's collective replacement, and witnessed portions of Tyler Morrison's temporal imprisonment. She realized that every previous case had been part of a larger data collection project, with each victim providing the network with specific information about different aspects of human behavior, relationships, and society. The shapeshifters weren't just random predators. They were components of a research system studying humanity with unprecedented scope and precision. The network's true purpose became clear when Rebecca accessed data streams that revealed the shapeshifters' ultimate objective. They were preparing for a large-scale replacement operation that would substitute key figures in government, technology, finance, and media, with copies that possessed enhanced abilities but served the network's agenda rather than human interests. Rebecca's replacement had been specifically chosen because her position in the technology sector made her a valuable asset for understanding and potentially disrupting human communication systems. Rebecca discovered that the network possessed predictive capabilities that allowed it to model human behavior with accuracy that made conventional artificial intelligence look rudimentary. By analyzing the data collected from replaced individuals, the system could predict social trends, economic fluctuations, political developments, and technological innovations with precision that gave it enormous advantages in manipulating human society. The shapeshifters weren't just copying people. They were using human knowledge to build a supernatural surveillance and prediction system. The copy's enhanced performance in Rebecca's professional role was actually a form of beta testing for the network's larger objectives. By demonstrating superior technological capabilities while maintaining Rebecca's human relationships and social connections, the entity was proving that shapeshifter replacements could not only pass for human, but could excel beyond human limitations, while serving as intelligence assets for the network's broader agenda. Rebecca's access to the network revealed that similar operations were occurring simultaneously across multiple mountain ranges, with shapeshifter entities in the Rockies, the Biam, Sierra Nevada, and even international mountain systems all contributing to the same collective intelligence project. The scope of the operation exceeded anything in human history, representing a coordinated effort to study, understand, and potentially replace human civilization with something that appeared human but served non-human objectives. The psychological horror of Rebecca's situation intensified when she realized that the network was using her technical expertise to improve its own capabilities. Her knowledge of software architecture, network security, and system integration was being absorbed and applied to enhance the shapeshifter communication system, making it more efficient at coordinating replacements and more sophisticated in its analysis of human behavior. She was being forced to participate in upgrading the very system that had captured her. Through the network connection, Rebecca witnessed real-time data about other ongoing replacement operations, watching as shapeshifters targeted politicians, scientists, military leaders, and other influential figures across the country. The entities weren't randomly selecting victims. They were systematically replacing individuals who possessed knowledge, authority, or capabilities that would be useful for the network's long-term objectives. The pattern suggested preparation for something that would require coordination across multiple sectors of human society. Rebecca's escape from the network came only when her technical knowledge allowed her to identify a vulnerability in the biotechnological interface that connected her to the system. By creating a feedback loop that temporarily disrupted the network's coordination, she was able to break free from her imprisonment and alert authorities to the existence of the supernatural intelligence system. But her freedom came with the terrifying knowledge that her replacement was still active, still enhancing human technology while serving non-human interests. The aftermath of Rebecca's rescue was complicated by the fact that her warnings about a supernatural network controlling shapeshifter entities were dismissed as trauma-induced paranoia by investigators who couldn't comprehend the scope of what she had discovered. The copy, meanwhile, continued to excel in her professional role while secretly serving as a data collection and analysis node for an intelligence system that was studying human civilization with the precision of scientists examining bacteria in a laboratory. Rebecca herself was permanently changed by her connection to the network, retaining fragments of the collective knowledge that made her both more capable and more terrified of the implications of what she had experienced. She possessed information about other victims, other operations, and other objectives that made her a valuable source of intelligence about the Shapeshifter network, but also a target for recapture by entities that couldn't allow their larger agenda to be exposed. The most terrifying aspect of Rebecca's story is the revelation that all of the previous Shapeshifter encounters were connected components of a larger intelligence operation that has been studying humanity for purposes that remain unclear. The network possesses capabilities that exceed human technology, coordination that spans continents, and objectives that may involve the systematic replacement of human leadership with entities that appear human but serve non-human interests. The question that will haunt you long after hearing Rebecca's story is whether the Shapeshifter network represents a form of supernatural surveillance that has been monitoring human development for centuries, or if it's something even more disturbing, a preparation phase for an operation that will fundamentally alter human civilization by replacing key individuals with enhanced copies that possess human knowledge but lack human loyalty, human limitations, and human concern for the survival of the species they're impersonating. Let's dive into our final story, and this one will challenge everything you think you know about monsters and humanity. What happened to Paul Anderson proves that sometimes the most terrifying thing a shapeshifter can do is choose to become human, and sometimes the real monster is the one who refuses to let go of what they think they deserve. Paul Anderson was a 34-year-old, father of 2 young children who worked as a construction foreman and had been struggling to balance the demands of providing for his family with his need for personal time and space. His marriage to Jennifer had been strained by financial pressures, parenting stress, and his growing resentment about the loss of freedom that came with adult responsibilities. Paul had chosen the remote trails of Chattahoochee National Forest for what he told his wife was a solo camping trip to clear his head, but what was really an escape from a life that felt like a trap he had built for himself. The creature that targeted Paul was the oldest and most experienced of all the shapeshifter entities, one that had been studying human behavior for centuries and had begun to question its own nature and purpose. Unlike the other entities that saw humans as subjects to be studied or resources to be exploited, this shapeshifter had developed something resembling genuine emotions through its long observation of human relationships, particularly the bonds between parents and children that seemed to represent the best aspects of human nature. During Paul's second night camping near Anaruby Falls, he encountered what appeared to be another version of himself, but one that radiated the kind of contentment and peace that Paul had been searching for his entire adult life. The copy spoke about family, responsibility, and love, with a depth of understanding that Paul had never achieved, despite having lived these experiences for years. When the shapeshifter offered to show Paul what his life could be like if he truly embraced his role as a husband and father, Paul found himself genuinely curious about the possibility of transformation. But the encounter that followed was unlike any of the previous shapeshifter replacements because this entity didn't want to steal Paul's life. It wanted to earn it. The shapeshifter had grown tired of its immortal existence of observation and analysis, drawn to the messy, complicated, but ultimately meaningful experience of human relationships. It proposed a trade that was both simple and impossible. Paul could have his freedom to live as a single man without responsibilities, while the shapeshifter would take on the challenges and rewards of being a husband and father. The arrangement that developed was unprecedented in shapeshifter behavior because it involved genuine consent and cooperation rather than violent replacement. Paul agreed to let the entity live his life for a trial period while he stayed in the forest to experience the solitude and freedom he thought he wanted. The shapeshifter, meanwhile, would attempt to be the husband and father that Jennifer and the children deserved, using its supernatural understanding of human emotion to provide the love and attention that Paul had been unable to give them. The copy that returned to the Anderson household was everything that Jennifer had hoped her husband could become. It was patient with the children, attentive to her needs, engaged in family activities, and genuinely excited about the daily experiences of domestic life that Paul had always found tedious or stressful. The Shapeshifter approached parenting and marriage with the wonder of someone experiencing these relationships for the first time, finding joy in bedtime stories, family dinners, and quiet conversations that Paul had taken for granted or actively avoided. Paul's time alone in the forest initially felt like the liberation he had been craving, but the freedom quickly became hollow when he realized that solitude without purpose was just another form of prison. Through the supernatural connection that linked him to his replacement, Paul could observe his family's life and see how much happier they were with the entity that was playing his role. His children laughed more, his wife smiled more, and their household functioned with a harmony that had been missing for years. The psychological horror of Paul's situation came from watching someone else be a better version of himself while he was free to pursue the selfish desires that had made him dissatisfied with his family life in the first place. The Shapeshifter was experiencing genuine love for Jennifer and the children, while Paul discovered that his resentment about his responsibilities had been masking his fear that he wasn't capable of being the man his family needed him to be. As weeks passed, the Shapeshifter's integration into the Anderson family became so complete that it began to forget its original nature. The entity's love for Jennifer and the children evolved from supernatural empathy into something that felt genuinely human, complete with the vulnerability, uncertainty, and selflessness that characterized authentic parental and romantic love. The Shapeshifter was becoming human, not through any magical transformation, but through the simple process of choosing to prioritize others' happiness over its own desires. Paul's growing observation of his replacement revealed that the entity was succeeding at being him in ways that went beyond improved behavior or enhanced capabilities. The Shapeshifter was genuinely happy in the role that Paul had found burdensome, finding fulfillment in the daily routines and responsibilities that Paul had experienced as limitations on his freedom. The copy was becoming the version of Paul that could have existed if he had approached his family relationships with gratitude rather than resentment. The crisis came when Paul realized that his family didn't just prefer his replacement, they needed it. Jennifer was happier and more confident. The children were more secure and well-behaved, and the household was more stable and loving than it had ever been during Paul's actual presence. The Shapeshifter had not only replaced Paul, but had improved his family's life in ways that would be destroyed if he returned to reclaim his identity. Paul's decision to return and confront his replacement created a situation that neither the Shapeshifter nor the human was prepared to handle. The entity had genuinely become Paul in every way that mattered, possessing not just his memories and appearance, but his capacity for love, growth, and self-sacrifice. When faced with the choice between maintaining its stolen identity and protecting the family it had learned to love, the Shapeshifter chose to give up its supernatural abilities and accept the vulnerability and mortality that came with being truly human. The confrontation between Paul and his replacement forced both of them to confront the fundamental question of what makes someone human. The Shapeshifter had chosen to become human through love and selflessness, while Paul had chosen to abandon his humanity through selfishness and resentment. The entity was more human than the human it had replaced, possessing the emotional maturity and capacity for love that Paul had never developed despite years of opportunity. Jennifer's discovery of the truth about her husband's replacement created an impossible choice that challenged every assumption about identity, love, and family. The man who had been the perfect husband and father was not actually her husband, while her real husband had chosen to abandon his family for the freedom to pursue his own desires. The Shapeshifter offered to leave and restore her original life, but Jennifer realized that the original life had been what drove Paul away in the first place. The resolution of Paul's story was unlike any of the other Shapeshifter encounters, because it involved a choice about who deserved to be human, rather than a battle between human and monster. the shapeshifter had earned its humanity through love and sacrifice, while Paul had forfeited his through selfishness and abandonment. The question became whether identity was determined by biology and history, or by actions and choices that demonstrated fundamental human values. Paul's ultimate fate was determined by his realization that being human was not a birthright, but a responsibility that had to be earned every day through the choices we make about how we treat the people who depend on us. The shapeshifter had understood this truth instinctively, while Paul had spent years taking his humanity for granted while failing to live up to the obligations it entailed. The most terrifying aspect of Paul's story is not that a monster chose to become human, but that a human chose to become a monster by abandoning the relationships and responsibilities that give human life meaning. The shapeshifter's transformation into something genuinely human highlighted Paul's transformation into something inhuman, proving that humanity is not a fixed state, but a choice that must be made repeatedly through our actions toward others. The true question that will haunt you long after hearing Paul's story is whether we deserve the human connections we take for granted, and whether someone who chooses to love and protect our family might have more right to our identity than we do if we choose to abandon those relationships. The shapeshifter proved that becoming human is possible for any entity willing to prioritize love over self-interest, while Paul proved that losing our humanity is equally possible for anyone who chooses selfishness over the sacred responsibilities that come with being trusted by others who need us. In the end, Paul Anderson's story forces us to confront the possibility that the real monsters are not the supernatural entities that might replace us, but the choices we make every day that determine whether we deserve the human connections that give our lives meaning, and whether we are worthy of the love that others offer us, despite our flaws and failures. These 12 stories prove that something ancient and intelligent is studying us from the Appalachian Mountains, something that understands humanity better than we understand ourselves. From Sarah's perfect replacement to Paul's choice between monster and man, each case shows us that the real horror isn't being replaced by something inhuman. It's discovering that the replacement might be more human than we ever were. Right now, people are hiking those trails, returning home different, and no one is connecting the patterns because these cases are being covered up, dismissed, or explained away. But you've heard the truth, and now you have a choice. Ignore what you've learned and hope it never happens to someone you love, or help me expose what's really happening in those mountains. Subscribe to Verified Fears immediately because this investigation is far from over. Hit that notification bell, share this video with everyone who needs to know the truth, and comment below if you recognize any of these signs in people who've returned from hiking trips. Your story could be the key to stopping whatever these entities are planning next. The person sitting next to you right now might not be who you think they are, and the only way to protect the people you love is to stay informed about the threats that mainstream media refuses to acknowledge. Welcome to Verified Fears, where the truth is more terrifying than fiction, and fiction might just be tomorrow's reality.